Welcome to this video. This is a video in a series of 3 videos on systematic literature reviews. My name is Rüdiger Hahn. I'm a professor in sustainability management. I have ample of experience with systematic literature reviews, and this specific one here is about different search strategies, how you can apply them to identify a body of literature, how you can avoid pitfalls, and how you can also combine these different search strategies to come up with a superior sample in the end. Allow me to first briefly summarize these 3 videos for you. The first one was on the questions of why to do systematic literature reviews, what types of literature reviews are out there, how do you formulate adequate research questions. The second one, this is the one that you're in here right now, is about what search strategies can you use, what different search strategies, how can you use them, how can you combine them, and how can you also report on this method, on how you apply these different strategies. Finally, the next video will be on how can you code articles for literature reviews, how can you report on the results, how you can actually be really analytic, and how do you make a significant contribution to the literature through the literature review. So let's first have a look at the different search strategies. There are 3 main strategies that are usually applied and what they are. And then we're going to go deeper into each and every one of these 3 on the following slides. But first, there is a literature suggestion here. If you're interested, that's a method article on these different search strategies. So if you're interested, it's in the description. Have a look. It's a neat article that goes also in detail, in depth with these strategies. So the first strategy would be a database-driven search. That is usually the main strategy, the key strategy that you're using first. It consists of a keyword search in usually electronic databases. And I do have other videos out there as well that talks about how to do one of these keyword searches, how to optimize your keyword searches in these literature databases. So have a look if you're interested in that. As I said, that's usually the main starting point from which everything else follows. And from my experience, that gives you the bulk of literature already. However, no keyword search is perfect. That is why I usually suggest to have a look at other strategies as well to minimize risk that you lost any significant and relevant literature, and also as a signal to editors and to reviewers that you've been thorough in your search and that you really did your best to identify all the relevant literature that is out there. One of these strategies that you could apply is a journal-driven search. That means you identify a predefined selection of journals, the most important journals of your fields, however you want to determine that. There are, for many fields, journal rankings out there, or you could go for citations like impact factor or whatever. That depends, of course, a bit on your preferences, on your field, and so on. If you really go for the most important journal, then the benefit is that this increases the confidence of the reader that you heard the main voices in the field and that you didn't overlook any major publications in one of these important outlets. And then finally, the third strategy would be the seminal work-driven approach. That means you try to identify really seminal work, very important papers, and then screen forward and backwards in the citations. What is a seminal paper? That is something to determine as well. It can be based on citations, for example, or any other means. Sometimes you can also go for seminal journals, most cited journals in your sample, and take the articles from there. That depends a bit on how you want to approach that. And then you try to find out who influenced the field. So what is really the seminal work that influenced your field that you're researching in, and that's important for your research question. And also who influenced these influential papers. So by whom were they impressed? Whom do they build on? And these three strategies usually complement each other. And I suggest using ideally all three of them, at least two of them. Of course, that depends a bit on what you're looking at, in what field you're active, and so on. So let's dig a bit deeper into the database search first, because as I said, that would be the anchor, the starting point for most of the other searches that you do, and it should actually yield most of the relevant results for the topic that you're trying to do your research on. So first you have to decide what databases you want to look at, in what database you want to apply in terms of the keyword search. A good choice for many searches is usually the Web of Science or the Scopus database. They are both very broad in terms of the topics they cover and so on, but obviously the type of the database and the specific database depends very much on what you're actually looking for, whether there is a specific database for your field of search that is more applicable, I don't know, in medicine or in economics or whatever, so that you can have a look at these if there are specific ones. Sometimes it depends on the language of the articles and so on, so you might want to have a look at the internet, do some research on what would be applicable databases for your area. And then some advice with the keyword search. I'm going to talk about how to build a keyword search on the next slide, and I also have specific videos on that. But I usually advise people to try to cover as much ground as possible with the database search. So find as many articles as possible that are relevant for your topic, however, without adding too much noise. So you usually want to have a situation in which ideally most, if not all, relevant articles are in your database search already. Usually it's not possible to cover all of them because some are really difficult to find depending on the title the authors use and stuff like that. But as a rule of thumb, the gross to net ratio for your hits, so meaning that the gross ratio would be the total hits that your database search comes up with, and the net number of articles is those articles from the gross number that are really relevant specifically for your topic that you want to do research on. You usually no, actually you never have a 1 to 1 ratio, because that would mean that each and every hit in your database search is really in the end relevant, and that's actually quite impossible, because it would mean that you would probably missed out too many relevant hits because they were using other kinds of keywords and so on and so on and so on. So as a first rule of thumb, I'd usually look at the gross to net ratio of relevant hits to irrelevant hits for your database search of 1 to 4 up to 1 to 20. So you have to do quite a bit of manual combing through the results to see whether they are really relevant for you or not. If you have a ratio of less than 1 to 20, then there are really many irrelevant hits, and that of course then intensifies the screening work that you have to do. So you have to do lots of manual screening, and that is actually a task that is not the nicest one to do. So if the ratio becomes too small in terms of 1 to 30, 40, 50, then there's lots of work to do and you only have few relevant articles. So I try to avoid that by adjusting my search strategy. And again, I have my own video on these search strategies for the databases if you're interested in that. However, if the ratio is more than 1 to 4, so if you're looking at 1 to 3, 1 to 2, or as I mentioned earlier, 1 to 1, so that means that each and every hit that you have with your database search is relevant for your final literature review, then there is an increasing risk of missing out relevant articles, because not every author uses the same types of keywords in the title, for example, and so on, so that you will miss out relevant articles, and you try to avoid missing out too many relevant articles, because that would be a downside for your literature review actually. And then there is my final advice here for that part. Avoid garbage in, garbage out problems. Really learn how to use these databases. Learn how to use Boolean operators. You learn how to restrict the searches you have, for example, by year, by languages, by topics, by peer-reviewed articles, whatever you want to refine your search to. Really, trial and error. You have to try that out in the databases. And as I mentioned, I have specific videos, especially on that, on search strategies, on using database options, using and combining Boolean operators to actually arrive at an like as optimal as possible result that you could get. And in trying out, you then should actually have a look, do you add or lose relevant literature when making changes in your keywords and so on. Speaking about keywords, the most crucial point, actually, as I mentioned just before, about your database search is to find the right search string. And that means to combine different keywords usually. So you really want to make sure that your keyword search is sound and that you actually applied the right screening criteria. I'm only going to give you a very few hints here because that's actually part of a different and much longer video. So if you're interested in that, have a look. So here you see an example of one of our keyword searches, how we displayed it actually in the paper, how we displayed it and provided transparency to the reviewers, to the readers and so on. So if you're interested in how you can actually display that, show that, then have a look at some of my example literature reviews if you're interested. Here in this case, for example, we were looking for behavioral topics in so-called sustainable supply chain management. So supply chain management that deals with ecological and social issues and so on. And we were looking at really individual level behavior. For that, we combined two search terms here, just to give you a brief idea. So this first one was to identify literature on sustainable supply chain management. And for that, we combined here the supply chain with the sustainability aspects in a title search. And we added here these behavioral issues then as well in a title abstract keyword search, which has many synonyms for actually behavioral topics and so on. And that combined was the search term here for this specific literature review. The next steps that I usually then do, these are relevant for actually all search strategies, not only for the database search here, so they're also going to be relevant for the journal-based search and for the Seminal work-based search that I'm going to explain in the next couple of slides. So that's relevant for all of them. You need to really formulate clear criteria on what to include in your literature review and also what not to include. There are usually decisions that you have to make about when a topic is relevant for you and when not. Just to give an example here again for the literature review that we conducted here on behavioral issues on sustainable supply chain management. We were looking at individual behavior, but there's also a topic called organizational behavior. And for the keyword here of behavior, for example, we also had hits on organizational behavior. That includes, for example, organizational culture and stuff like that. But we're not interested in that. So we sorted these articles out. So we made a clear note, okay, no articles that deal with organizational behavior, for example. There were other criteria that we used of when we included or excluded certain articles that were not fitting to the specific topic. And I really advise you to write them down and make them transparent also in the paper, at least superficially, so that the readers know how you actually determine the fit of the respective articles for your literature review. Then the next advice is that you use 2 or more coders to determine the thematic fit of the articles. So don't do it alone. Because I know from fact and from experience that different people make different interpretations with regards to topics, content, or whatever when judging the same article. And in this case, you have to arrive at a consensus. You really need to talk about why did person A think that article is relevant for your review and person B thought it was not relevant. Because if that's the case, you really need to find a solution to improve the quality of your decisions, actually. And that is really, really important from my experience. So try to include more than one coder for the thematic fit of the articles in the first step. I usually then apply a two-step approach. In the first step, I'm looking through the titles and the abstracts of the articles only, and try to determine from reading the title and the abstract whether or not an article that popped up in my keyword search is actually really relevant for me, or just went into the sample more or less by coincidence because it was just found by the keywords here, but has a totally different topic. The reason I'm doing this first is because that's really much easier than reading the full text. If you have like a few thousand hits in your keyword search, and that is something that really regularly happens to me, you have to look through 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, something like that, papers actually, and you cannot read the full papers, but it's usually enough to read the title and abstracts first, and then if you're in doubt, include it at that point of time. If you're not in doubt, either if you think it's in, then of course it's in, but if you're not in doubt that it's totally different topic, then you can discard it and say, okay, I won't look at that again. And then in the second step, you look at the full text of the articles, especially of those that you were previously in doubt whether, and you couldn't really tell whether or not they're relevant or not. For these articles, and again, use two coders here. For these articles, you then look at the full text to determine whether or not they're relevant for you to arrive at your final sample from the keyword search. And then I usually also apply a so-called journal-driven search, as I mentioned earlier, to complement the keyword search. The idea is that a journal-driven search kind of combs through the most important journals in the field with the goal to increase the confidence that you did not miss any important articles with your database search. You could identify relevant journals in a field by a number of ways. You could, for example, use ratings. Some of the ratings that I mentioned here are business-related ratings, for example. There are probably other ratings for fields of science, like natural science, physics, mathematics, medicine. I don't know them, but you could have a look at these and identify those journals that are supposedly the most relevant for your field. Or you could go by impact factor or whatever. That depends highly on where you want to publish, in which field you're active in, and so on. Once you have your list of journals that you want to manually look through, decide which years you want to cover. One example would be to have a look at the descriptive statistics of your database search. And have a look how the number of articles developed over time through your database search of those articles, of course, that are finally relevant only. Maybe you see that from year X on, the number of publications increased like dramatically, so that might be a year that you would like to start looking through. Or you could have a look whether there are certain seminal events, like historical events that influence the field you would like to search, and that might be something that you could use as well as a starting year for your research, or for your search here through the journal databases, the journal-driven search. Next would be then the search process. You could here actually do two things. First would be to again go for a keyword search. So usually you can have, or you can apply keywords also to specific journals, either in the databases or on the journal websites. However, I actually do not recommend you to do a keyword search here again, because you already did that with a database search. So the likelihood that you generate new hits by applying the same keywords just to specific journals, it's really unlikely that you generate any new articles, and that's what you actually want to do. So what is usually the way to go is that you do a so-called issue by issue search. So you really go through each issue of the respective journals throughout the years manually, and again look through titles and abstracts, and if applicable later on through the full papers, just as I mentioned it earlier. You can do that either via the journal websites usually, or you can also sometimes use some of the databases. That depends a bit on what's in there and what you want to do. That is actually a pretty time-consuming process sometimes, and here the number of really relevant hits decreases usually dramatically. So in the keyword search, you were actually looking for specific combinations of keywords which you thought or think are relevant for your literature search. You actually don't do that in an issue-by-issue search, so there's much more published in the journals that's not related at all to the specific topic that you're looking at. So the number of irrelevant hits increases dramatically. That's totally normal. So if you, it's not seldom that you look through, I don't know, 1,000 titles in an issue by issue search and only have one or two relevant hits. That might actually happen. Something you cannot avoid, but the idea is here again to increase confidence that you do not miss any important articles. And you then usually apply, of course, the same screening criteria and procedures as in the database search. And then again, do actually not look at the gross to net ratio for relevant hits here for a journal driven search as you would do in a keyword search, because that just doesn't work. As I explained earlier, it's much worse than for a database search. Okay, then let's finally turn to the seminal work-driven approach, which tries to identify who is influenced in the field or by whom these influential articles again were influenced. The goal here, similar to the journal-driven search, is to increase the confidence that you did not miss any important articles, so that you broaden your search actually. And you can do this in the following way. So the first step would be to actually identify seminal articles in your preliminary sample. So the sample that you generated from the keyword search and from the journal-driven search potentially as well. So you have a look, okay, this is my preliminary sample. These are the articles that are relevant. So let's just assume that you look through, I don't know, 5,000 articles and that 150 articles are relevant from a content perspective for your specific literature review. So 150 articles, that's your preliminary sample. And now you have to determine which of these are actually seminal works. So you can do that in two ways. The first one would be to go with citations, for example, Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, one of these databases, and have a look how often are these 150 articles in your sample cited in the literature. And then you take, I don't know, the most important, like 10%, 20%, whatever. So assume that you have 15 articles that are really well cited, and then you have a rather large cutoff in the sites, and then you take these 15 for your seminal work-driven approach and work with these 15 further. The pro side, the advantage of this citation-based search is that you actually focus on the single article and really look at which paper in your preliminary sample is really influential. The negative side, however, is that newer articles that have just recently been published are usually undervalued because they did not have the chance yet to get cited much. So in this case, you have a prejudice somehow on older articles. You can maybe do that by weighting citations from the last couple of years a bit yeah, a bit higher, but that's also something that sometimes really doesn't work out well. So that is something that you have to deal with, and see whether that's really relevant for you or not. An alternative approach thus would be to approximate seminal work by not looking at the single article in your preliminary sample, but looking at the journals in your preliminary sample and determine seminal work through these journals. In this case, you don't look at the single article, but rather you look at, for example, journal citation rankings or journal image via one of these journal rankings that I mentioned earlier. Something like that would be possible. And then you have a look, okay, which are the seminal journals, and then have a look, okay, which article in my preliminary sample is cited in these journals and which other ones are not, so that you only look at those that are published in the seminal journals again. The negative side is that you're then not really looking at the single piece of research, at the single article, so it's technically not really seminal work but seminal journal, so it's broader. On the benefit side, you don't have the problems with undervaluing newer articles that you have with the citation based approach, so you have to decide what you want to do. The second step then is that you actually search through these articles. Again, assume that you have 150 in total in your preliminary sample and you identified 15 as seminal work through either one of the two approaches I just mentioned. And for these 15, you can now do two things also in combination. Let's talk about the first one first. You can do a backward search, and the backward search actually asks who influenced these seminal articles. So you actually have a look at the reference list, for example, for the backward search at these of these papers, and go through the reference list piece by piece and have a look who do these cite, these seminal works, these seminal articles cite, and are these then somehow relevant for my topic as well. And the second question would be who was actually influenced by these articles, and that's called a forward search because you're looking forward in time from the time when the respective article was published. So you look at citations of these seminal articles, and again then determine whether or not these articles that cite the seminal articles that are already in your preliminary sample, and have a look whether these are topically relevant or not. Both can be conducted via databases, forward and backward search, and the backward search itself can also simply be conducted by going through the reference list of the seminal papers. And then again, you apply the same screening procedure as previously in the database search. So you look at the same criteria, whether or not an article is relevant for you, and then decide whether or not you want to include it into your final sample. Finally, again, just as with the journal-driven approach, don't look at the gross net ratio here for relevant hits, because again, this is something that is usually far broader than a keyword search in the database. So it's not really helpful to look at that ratio here. Okay, that's basically it about how to identify your sample. Now just a few words on potentially restricting the sample. It might be that your sample is either still too large to do a proper review. If it has, like, I don't know, 500 articles or whatever, then it's really difficult to go for a systematic literature review and review all the content of the articles. And it might also be that you artificially want to restrict your sample due to some other reasons. I'm just going to go through that rather quickly because I have more insights on that, an own video again here on using databases for systematic literature reviews. You can have a look at that. So just quickly, frequently used restrictions, for example, that I apply very often are restricting to English language articles, and also very often to journal articles, peer-reviewed articles. That again depends a bit on what type of review are you doing, in what field are you active, what's your topic, and so on. You could also restrict by publication years. So for example, only newer publications or whatever. I would usually not do that in the first place. So default option would be to have no restrictions. However, you can do that if there were, for example, any important events in the past that influenced research or practices or whatever, so that you say that from that date on the field changed, so that I would like to mirror that in my search as well. Then you can go for date restrictions, for example. And again, you might need to deal differently here with different search approaches. I mentioned that already. With a journal-driven search, you usually cannot go through all um, um, volumes of all journals that you identified in a journal-driven search back until the year, I don't know, 1910 or whatever, if it's really old journal. That's usually not possible, just for practical reasons. In this case, you have to usually install a publication line here at some point of time and apply that in a journal-driven search, but that might be different for the keyword search, which is much more pinpointed. You could also restrict topics very often, journal topics, according to the databases that you use. That might be different in different databases. That might be especially relevant if you have very many keyword hits, so in the database search, and many of them are irrelevant. As an example, that actually does happen quite a lot if you use abbreviations as keywords, because an abbreviation that you use in your field for a specific term might be used entirely different in another field of research, so that if you use an abbreviation as keyword, then you yield hits that are totally irrelevant for you, and by limiting your search in the journal databases to certain journal topics, you could sometimes avoid that. Sometimes it's not necessary. And finally, one thing that is also potentially relevant is to look at journal quality. That depends very much on the aim of your study, what you want to do, how inclusive you want to be, and sometimes also on the review process. So that depends a bit. As I mentioned earlier, you have different rankings, for example, journal rankings in different fields that you could use. You could look at citations, impact factors, or something like that. On the negative side, yes, you do lose thematically relevant literature because you already found that this literature is relevant from a theoretical, from a thematic point of view. On the negative, like on the positive side, however, there's actually really some, just to name it like that, some stupid articles out there, method-wise really dubious, and I think it's not really wise to give every article a voice through a literature review if it's really qualitatively questionable. So that might be something to consider when looking, for example, at journal quality indicators. But again, that depends very much on what you want to do and where you come from. And then my final slide here, content-related slide here in this presentation. Once you did all that, once you applied the different search strategies, you need to convince the reader that you were actually really thorough, that you did not overlook something really important, any major flaws in your search or whatever. But of course, you have a rather limited space in a paper in which you can actually talk about the method and all the criteria used, and so on and so on and so on. However, try to be as transparent as possible. Transparency actually increases confidence in your methodological approach. Here is just one example from one of my own articles, literary review articles, how we depicted the entire process and try to condense it as much as possible without losing relevant information, relevant content. You see here on the left hand side, that was the database driven approach. So you see that we started with a search term composition, search two databases. it yielded that many results here. We then screened title and abstracts, so we came down to that many results. We read the full text of these, and then in the end we ended up here with that number of articles. So that was first the journal-driven search. Then we complemented that with the, that was a database-driven search. Then we complemented that with the journal-driven search here. So we started with identifying journal subject areas and had a look at the most important journals in the respective fields here. We then looked through 11 journals, issue by issue, and we mentioned the year which we started here. That's the number of articles we looked at. We first went here in this case, and we just divided that approach. So while we looked at directly at title abstract years, that would have been too much here to look at 7,000. So we started here with first just going through the titles. We ended up with that number here. In this case, afterwards, we screened the abstracts, ended with that number here. And for that number, we read the full text and ended up with 14 articles here from the journal-driven approach, which we added to our sample. And then we came up with the third strategy. That was the Seminal work-driven approach here. Our preliminary sample from the two other approaches was 185 articles. So in this case, we went for this journal approach that I mentioned previously. So we looked at all the ones that were in the first quartile of the Scimago journal ranking in terms of impact factor citations. And then we checked 74 articles actually backward and forward. So one of the 185 that we had in our preliminary sample, 74 were in the Q1 quartile. And then again, we first checked the titles, then the abstracts, and we end up adding another 68 articles to our sample, which was then a full sample of 204 articles. And you see that here 185 plus 68 doesn't equal to 204, because in this case then we excluded again articles here from the third and fourth quartile from the Scimago journal ranking to have these lower impact articles or journals out of our sample, because we wanted to make this cutoff here and make it a bit more approachable and also get rid of some of the most questionable journals in this case here, of which we were not really confident that they had some significant quality. So that was the 204, including, however, here 4 articles that were then even suggested to us by reviewers, which we didn't get through these three search approaches: database, journal, and Seminal work-driven approach. So although we screened here in total like around 16,000 articles in total, at least title-wise, there were still 4 articles that we missed that were suggested to us by reviewers, which we then included in the search here as well, or in the final sample as well. And sometimes it even might happen that you have one of these approaches that yields 0 results. We had that actually at a paper that is currently under revision. We had the journal-based driven approach, and initially we mentioned that we did all that, and then here in this here there was simply a 0, so we couldn't add any articles through the journal-driven approach. So in this case, we like within the revision process, we simply skipped that here to make the figure a bit more leaner. However, we mentioned in the method section that we did that as well, and it didn't yield any further results, again to increase confidence in our approach. Yeah, and links to the articles are all in the description of the video if you want to have a look at that at a real life example. And that's it actually. That was the third video of 3 in this series on systematic literature reviews. I hope that was helpful. As I mentioned earlier, there is another video on how to use databases specifically for systematic literature reviews. If you're interested, have a look at that as well. And now I wish you all the best for your own systematic literature reviews and for your own research.